our studios in New York, here again is Stone Phillips.
Returning to our story about sudden acceleration, cars that seem to take off on their own. You've heard how Ford vigorously denies that wiring problems on any of its cars has ever caused a case of sudden acceleration. But you're about to see what some internal Ford memos say and meet some mechanics who thought something was going on besides drivers hitting the wrong pedals.
By any measure, sudden acceleration is rare, but this mechanic in Boston says he's seen it with his own eyes, not once, but twice.
These are the tire marks right here?
Still here after all these years.
Junior D'Amato says one day outside his shop, he heard a crash. A woman's car had just hit a school bus. The back tires were still spinning.
We saw the tire smoking, and we saw the brake lights on at the same time.
So she had her foot on the brakes.
The brake lights were on.
And within months, another customer brought in a different Ford-built car, complaining it too had taken off. D'Amato says he left that car idling outside his shop with nobody inside to press any pedal.
All of a sudden, the engine started to scream and roar.
It just started to roar.
Just like someone was in it and put it right to the floor, yes.
Junior D'Amato is more than a mechanic. He writes a weekly column about auto repair syndicated in newspapers across the country. When he called Ford back in 1991 to report the problem, the company sent out an investigator, but told D'Amato it couldn't find a problem with the car.
All we're going to do is just loosen it, unplug it.
So years later, when D'Amato heard about Sam Sero's short circuit theory, he says he decided to try it for himself.
Okay.
He showed Dateline how he deliberately loosened that first black wire to the cruise control.
I just unplugged it.
We started the van, but left it in park so it wouldn't actually move. Then we watched as D'Amato deliberately nicked the insulation on one of those other two wires, then grounded it.
And it happens that fast?
That fast. Quicker than you can blink your eye.
It's either one of these wires.
Either one. That's one wire, and this is another wire.
Now, is that actually pulling down the gas pedal?
It'll actually move the gas pedal.
Now, as long as that continues to be there, this is going to keep revving. Pretty much.
Remember, the van's not taking off because we never put it in gear. And the engine is roaring, even though D'Amato never turned the cruise control button on. He didn't have to. Ford admits that in some, but not all, of its models built before 1995, the cruise control is always getting power, even at a dead stop.
Does your experience tell you that this is a reasonable explanation for these sudden acceleration incidents?
I would have to go with that assumption, yeah.
Of course, Junior D'Amato didn't find those shorted wires. He created them. But Dateline discovered there's another mechanic who did find something. A wiring problem on a Ford that had suddenly accelerated through a parking lot. Long before engineer Sam Sero was involved in sudden acceleration lawsuits, Larry Miller was the service manager at this Ford dealership in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. In 1990, a customer came in complaining that his new Ford Aerostar had suddenly taken off by itself.
There was no question in his mind.
No question
His
whatsoever.
foot was on the brake.
Correct.
Never on the accelerator.
Correct.
Robert Mull was driving. His wife Sally was sitting next to him.
And we just flew. We were hitting speed bumps.
After bouncing over the bumps, she says the runaway engine quieted down as mysteriously as it had roared. So Miller says he called Ford's national hotline for help. This is a written record of that call from Ford's own files. It shows how Miller reported the van took off through a parking lot after the engine went to full throttle. The first recommendation from Ford headquarters? Check for chafing on wires from speed control amp to servo. The same wires Sam Sero says could cause problems. And Dateline discovered Ford wasn't just telling Miller. Remember how the pedal moved by itself when the cruise control kicked in? This is another Ford hotline report, same year. A Ford dealer from Virginia calls. Customer says vehicle went to wide open throttle and he could not hold it with the brakes. The recommendation from Ford headquarters? Question customer as to whether the accelerator pedal actually moved or not. If so, check the wiring between the speed control amp and the servo for shorts. Now remember, Ford told that jury back in Ohio that it never found a case in the real world where wiring shorts had caused sudden acceleration, that it just doesn't happen. So why would experts at Ford headquarters be telling a mechanic in the field to check the wiring? Ford told Dateline it was simply telling mechanics about every possibility, however remote.
Where these wires were touching.
But it turns out, when Larry Miller started checking wires, he actually found something. We don't have the original cruise control, so on another one, Miller showed Dateline where 8 years ago, he'd found 2 wires hidden inside, nearly touching.
The solder joint coming off of this wire had dripped down to where it was almost touching the gray-black wire. And our contention is that when he put it in gear, it jerked just enough to make contact with those wires.
That's just one of the things that would have to have gone wrong. But Miller thought he'd uncovered an important clue.
There's not a doubt in my mind that that's what caused this one.
And he reported it back to the hotline.
Dealer called back to inform.
This all happened when Ford says it was in the midst of a massive and expensive investigation of sudden acceleration. But instead of checking the van for itself, Ford closed the case.
So nobody from Ford came out to see firsthand for themselves what you reported over the hotline?
No.
In a letter to Dateline, Ford defended its decision to close the case, finding its car was not to blame. Although Miller may have identified one of the 5 malfunctions that must happen simultaneously, Ford said he didn't find the others. But was Ford already hearing about the other malfunctions, which combined could cause sudden acceleration? Dateline reviewed internal Ford documents, including this one, written 3 years before Larry Miller's call. It lists the problems in some of Ford's cruise controls, including water in the amplifier, open circuits. And remember that plastic dump valve cutoff switch on the brakes? Pinched dump valve hoses. Ford told Dateline it was just a routine list to improve performance, and that Miller didn't pinpoint any of those problems. When all of the facts are considered, the company says, it is clear that Ford acted appropriately when it closed its investigation. But take a look at what this internal Ford memo was saying back in 1990. Even as Ford closed the case, a Ford zone manager was summing it up saying, Larry Miller eventually found a fault in the cruise control which could have caused a sudden acceleration.